Welcome to the Radically Genuine Podcast. I am Dr. Roger McFillin, flying solo today. I'm going to start with a story. Recently wrote about it on my Substack, recalling a man who walked into my office a number of years back. He was a new client. At the time, he had been in the mental health system, prescribed drugs by a psychiatrist, too many therapies to even count. And he sat down and he said something that I rarely ever hear. And it was very refreshing. He said, I'm a jerk. I'm selfish. I want things my way all the time. When people don't give me what I want, I lash out and I hurt them. I get irritable the second I'm uncomfortable. A lot of people don't like me. I don't like me. And then I sit around wondering why I'm lonely and miserable. He said, help me break the cycle, doc. I almost fell out of my chair. Not because what he said was profound, but because it was honest. And honesty has become one of the rarest things I encounter in my personal life and in my professional life, because there was no hiding behind a diagnosis. This is what you've seen in American culture throughout the course of my adult lifetime. It's progressively gotten worse. Usually people start with their diagnosis because that's what explains everything. And so there was no hiding behind bipolar, no reaching for ADHD that makes it nearly impossible for him to listen to anybody. There was no treatment-resistant depression to explain the wreckage behind him. It was just raw, uncomfortable self-awareness. And that means something. Because I want to talk about what I've watched 20 years in the field, slowly at first, then what appears to be have happened all at once. It's almost like we wake up one day, it's 2018 or 2019, and boom, everyone's got a psychiatric diagnosis. We've taken the ordinary flaws of being a human being, our tendency towards selfishness, entitlement, a short fuse, poor impulse control, to think about ourselves before other people. We began to relabel them as disorders, as conditions, not only just to drive a drug market. I think it also drives a sense of who we are as human beings and how do we approach the challenges of living. Like, what is the nature of reality? What is the nature of human existence? What I think at other points in human history were driven by philosophy, family, just beliefs and ideals about who you are, interacting with the environment. There's just certain principles when it comes to how to grow in life. Like, simply if you are a jerk yourself, or you have this tendency to externalize everything and not take personal responsibility, the world had a way of shaping you. You're not going to be very successful. You're not going to have strong relationships. You're not going to embody trustworthiness. And you're going to fail and fail and fail until you learn, which I think is the point of this human experience. Now, right up front, I'm not telling you that emotional pain and human suffering is fake, because that's what we've gotten into. Like, that's the argument when I say this mass pathologizing of the human experience and all this rise in psychiatric conditions is not real. I'm not telling you that no one ever struggles. Trauma is real. Challenges are real. It's as real as experiencing a fever. And some people, yes, they need some help. And I'm not denying that. That's not the argument. But the argument is this, that we've built an entire language that slowly and quietly converts behavior into a symptom, choice into a condition, consequences into a diagnosis. And that trait, it feels like mercy, it feels like compassion, but I think it functions more like a cage, a prison. So let's start with the scale of this. How did we get here? Well, part of it is this DSM, this diagnosis that we have slowly translated into a medical condition. It wasn't the point initially. It was just a way to try to document and integrate people who are seeking out help with emotional behavior problems into a greater medical system. But it's just exploded, and it's exploded with mass propaganda because industry became involved in that. And the incentives for the industry are to sell product. So to sell product, you have to have a theory, a belief system behind it. There is not a large enough market for people who are going to take mind and mood altering drugs for quote unquote mental illness. It did not exist. Suffering and struggle were an ordinary aspect of human life, often a reflection of the distinct challenges, the polarities, love and loss, failure, success, night and day. Right? We go through these dark periods. Human beings have been extraordinarily resilient over time. And going through the dark night of the soul, going through those passages in life, often is a crucible to growth into a new version of yourself, a version that is more wise, more self aware, more responsible, more compassionate. And then the older you become, the wiser you become, and you pass on that information, that wisdom to younger generations. So what happens when you interfere with that process? Well, you interfere with the growth, the transformation, that transcendent process of going through pain and coming out the other side stronger. We've called it character development. We've called it resilience. We've called it natural maturation. And it is so diabolical, in my opinion, for mass indoctrination of an entire population to see emotional pain not as signals, not as ordinary aspects of life, not as your inner compass guiding you towards a more effective response to the challenges that exist. Now we start seeing it as a medical condition. And this is what we have seen with the medical industry, the mental health industrial complex. They say it's decreasing stigma to get people help, but really what it's doing is it's creating almost like a revisionist history of so many aspects of one's life. Sometimes it's a protection against those horrible feelings that we live with, like shame. I'll give you another example. Um, Another client, I'm not even going to give a name because that would make somebody believe that I'm breaking confidentiality. This is just a composite, right? But I've seen this, I've heard this throughout my career where somebody whose life has been blown up by, let's say, an affair, and then they describe that experience as mania, hypomania, right? And it's a way to kind of try to restore trust back, deal with the shame of a certain way that somebody behaved. I can understand it. If you did make a mistake and you did act in ways that are different than who you usually are, it does certainly make sense why you'd like to change the story around that. And I've watched this, right? Like where somebody who experiences a connection or a sexual attraction to someone else somehow becomes like repackaged as hypersexuality, or desire becomes a symptom. The deliberate choices someone makes, like a text message, every lie about where they were, the hotel room they booked, whatever that may be, it gets condensed into these new clinical worlds like impulsivity, manic, as I mentioned before. And the emotional highs and lows that any human being on earth would feel, especially while juggling challenges, the constant fear of getting caught in an affair and a nuclear bomb fallout when it comes to light, that all that emotional ability gets like diagnosed as bipolar 2. And so do you see like what's happened here? Throw ADHD, because I'm seeing bipolar 2, ADHD, major depressive disorder, these type of conditions widely applied. Everything that goes on gets now translated out of this language of choice and into this language of disease. And I remember that, like, one particular client, I asked her, like, how long did the psychiatrist spend with you before he handed you a diagnosis of bipolar disorder? She said about 15 minutes. Told her it was a pretty straightforward case. 15 minutes to diagnose a complex mood disorder. No prior history of mania anywhere in her life. Right after she detonated a 12-year marriage. So very convenient timing. I said that, and her eyes like flashed at me like a little bit of anger, and then it retreated into something more practiced. So, you don't understand what it's like to be out of control, she said. And I asked her very quietly, the only question that mattered, well, what if you weren't out of control? What if you were making choices? Terrible, destructive ones, no judgment, but choices nonetheless. What if the affair wasn't something that happened to you? What if it's something that you did? And it's almost like that look is, it's like, oh, you're not following the same script, the script that, everyone else is going to follow. But I think that was for her benefit. People hear me push someone like this and think I'm being cruel. It's not, it's the opposite. It's the diagnosis is the cruelty. The diagnosis told her that was never her doing any of it. It was something else outside of her. Like, it came upon her like the weather. And the bipolar story was just never true, but it was a palatable one. It was the one that let her husband forgive her. It was the one that lifted the crushing weight of her own shame off her chest. And I understand why she reached for it. I do. But understanding why she reached for it is not the same thing as being good for her. Because here's the logic these labels run on. And once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. Why did you have an affair? Because I have bipolar disorder. How do we know that you had bipolar disorder? Because you had an affair, right? It's this circular logic in the psychiatric labeling. And we've built an entire system that celebrates a person finally accepting their diagnosis. Like, it's almost like some people throw a little party for it. They add it to their Twitter profile. It becomes a part of their identity. And it remakes their entire life because every struggle, every mistake is now viewed from that lens. It's they're creating it in their mind. And the challenge of trying to help somebody through that is, if they believe their behavior is outside their control, if they believe that they were victims of a particular illness, where is the growth through that? Where is the painful dialogue that exists that you have to go through? The introspection. What was going on internally with me in the marriage? What was my mind doing? What was my mind saying? Was it worth it? Was I acting according to my values or my principles? Was I able to predict consequences? What did I get from the experience? How do I forgive myself, and how do I seek out forgiveness? Is this marriage the right marriage for me? All those difficult questions, they don't become the central aspect of a therapy for that person. Instead, it turns into managing hypomania, which is nonsense. You see this often too with parents. I'll give you another composite case. Let's just use two parents, sitting across from me, with like a 22-year-old son. We see this, and like there's a failure to launch. And what I mean by that is 22-year-old, not independent, maybe, let's say, abusing cannabis, partying a little too much. And they fall into this worldview that their son is self-medicating, right? And for these parents, he was self-medicating this depression and anxiety, which is an interesting narrative, right? Because again, it's not his fault. He's seeking out drugs in order to tame this inner illness, I guess, is what we framed it to be. Somewhere inside them, there's this illness, and You have to take a drug to tame it. And if you don't have the drug, then you turn to another drug like cannabis or alcohol. And in this particular situation, son was fired for the third time. They took him to a psychiatrist who said it was obvious he was struggling with undiagnosed mental illness. I looked at both of these parents who were both partners in a prestigious law firm who often checked their phones during the session. And there's a whole aspect of their son's life that just kept out of that story. More accurately, they avoid explaining their own role in where their son was. See, this kid was raised by a revolving door. Nannies came in and out. Daycare, 10 hours a day when he was younger, after school programs. Family vacations interrupted by urgent work calls. School events missed for client meetings. See, there's consequences to lifestyles people choose. They just weren't present, nor was there the act of parenting that is required to help transition a responsible young boy or an irresponsible young boy into a responsible one. And so when you talk about these things and you identify the real problems, it brings up shame. But I just view that shame and the struggle associated with that as growth. Like if you stop people from facing their darkness, how do they find their light? And you end up solving problems that don't exist. Because I can tell you, for that young 22-year-old, the answer wasn't more drugs. And all of a sudden he was going to become responsible, confident. No, I mean, he needed some consistent discipline in his life, one that wasn't modeled for him. No. See, when you're raised on phones and you're raised on video games, there's predictable consequences. And you go into the medical system, you're going to be labeled with like ADHD and depression and anxiety. Like, these are just predictable consequences of certain lifestyles. But they're also the solution. They're the answer for us on what has to change. Because when you turn to constant stimulation or you turn to a drug, what you're doing is that you're escaping that uncomfortable inner experience. This isn't a disorder. This is human. This is the absolute necessary aspects of transcendence. You have to go through that difficult period to get out on the other side. I mean, it's so much easier to say it's some neurochemical deficiency and look for some quick fix, but it's a lie. And live not by lies. We should live by truth. Feeling those uncomfortable emotions of shame can be beneficial. Because think of all the things that people do to protect themselves from shame. They enter into those alternative stories, and those stories take them the path where we enter into this diagnostic culture of mental illness. I think this kid, he's not even a kid, he's 22 years old, has to be able to face that fully for himself, independent of his parents. Yes, things were not provided to him that maybe other kids would have had, like loving, attentive parents. Yes, his parents were career focused. Yes, his parents were wealthy. I still think his parents love them, but they chose their careers over the hard work of being attentive and raising a son. And we see this more and more in our culture because we have so many distractions. It's just easier to put that iPad or that phone in front of a kid than have to deal with them being bored or behavioral problems or any of the other challenges that come through the process of raising a child. And this kid didn't need another diagnosis. He did need truth. He need parents who were going to be attentive to where he is now. They needed a mirror, not another specialist. Now, I'm not telling you that every struggling kid is a product of bad parents, I'm not telling you that trauma isn't real or there aren't neurodevelopmental differences that exist, because they do. And some kids are dealt a genuinely hard hand through no failure of anyone's. I sat with those families too. What I'm telling you is that we've lost the ability to tell the difference. And when you lose the ability to tell the difference, the default answer becomes a pill almost every time for everyone. And that's the catastrophe we're in. And there's no line anymore. Everything can become a psychiatric diagnosis. Everything. And this is what happens when you put this professional class on the front lines of dealing with every American problem and you take away hard fought lessons of ancestors and a strong parental presence and a respect for that, or faith based institutions. And you drive them into this professional class that has always sought a materialist biological understanding of life. And of course, you had public schools and American propaganda in the mix, and this is what you have. Let's talk about ADHD for a minute, because I can't tell you how many times I've had this conversation. Someone says, I can't focus on anything. My ADHD is so bad. And I ask, like, how many hours a day are you on your phone? Well, what does that have to do with anything? Humor me. Open your screen time report. And then you see the uncomfortable shifting in the chair. They reluctantly pull out the phone, tap a few times, turn it over with a shrug. 8 hours and 37 minutes yesterday alone. That's the average, folks. And I've seen this creep up over the course of the years. You know, it starts with 2 hours, it gets to 4 hours, then it gets to 8 hours. And I say, so let me get this straight. Your brain is getting hit with these algorithmically optimized dopamine hits for 8.5 hours a day. You interrupt your own thoughts something like 140 times to check notifications. You sleep with this thing 6 inches from your face. You wake up and start scrolling before your feet ever touch the floor. And you think the reason you can't read a book for 20 minutes is because you have a neurodevelopmental disorder? Most people look at me like I've grown a second head, because their psychiatrist is never once going to explain it that way. And here's the part I want you to sit with, because it's a science they skip. Your brain is not broken. Your brain is doing exactly what it's built to do. It adapts to whatever environment you put it in. You trained it on a slot machine for 9 hours a day, and it got very, very good at responding to a slot machine. The behavior shaped the brain, not the other way around. This is the whole thing flipped on its head. You tell a broken brain it explains behavior. I'm telling you that behavior can affect the brain. And the reaction I get, like wide eyes, defensive posture, and question every time, so I'm the problem? And they say like they've been accused of a war crime or something. And this is where we're at in American culture. Not like I've pointed out the most obvious cause and effect in the world. I always think, well, who else is responsible for the change? Your phone manufacturer? Mark Zuckerberg? Like, the loss of personal responsibility is so damaging, because you see this like visceral, almost allergic reaction to the idea of personal agency. That's conditioning. That's brainwashing. People recoil from responsibility like a vampire from sunlight. And victimhood has become so comfortable because it asks nothing of you, but it doesn't deliver anything for you either. That story keeps you stuck. The inevitable consequence of that is going to be emptiness, which will, of course, be labeled as another diagnosis. Now you're depressed. So I want to step back from some of these office stories now, because I think this is bigger than just a few clients. I'm sure everybody is really exposed to this. You can't get away from it. Like, everyone's got a psychiatric disorder. And there are people who've studied exactly this. I want to give you some names because that matters. There's a psychologist named Nick Haslam. He coined a phrase for what we've been describing. He calls it concept creep. His work shows concepts, like trauma, abuse, harm, disorder, have slowly expanded over the decades to cover milder and milder experiences. What does that mean, milder and milder? It means normal. A word that used to mean one thing now stretches to mean 10 things. The boundary keeps moving outward until almost everything qualifies. That's concept creep. And that is the entire engine of what I'm describing. Then there's a philosopher named Ian Hacking. And Hacking describes something he called the looping effect. The idea is that when you invent a category and name it, you change the very people the category describes. You name a kind of person into existence, and then people start living inside that category. They organize their identity around it. They start behaving in the ways the category predicts. Think about that. That's how influenced we are. You become it. Once it is entered into the collective consciousness, once you start identifying with it, you become it. This behavior loops back and seems to then confirm the category was real all along. Think about what that means. A diagnosis is not a neutral observation of something already there. The diagnosis participates in creating the thing. You hand a teenager an identity and they go build a life inside it. Trust me. This goes back to a psychologist named Julian Rotter, short version. People with an internal locus of control, people who believe their own actions shape their outcomes, do better on nearly every measure of life they can think of: health, relationships, achievement. And people with an external locus of control, people who believe outcomes happen to them, do much worse. So look at what the psychiatric narrative actually installs. It installs an external locus of control. It teaches you that the steering wheel was never in your hands. By the field's own measures, that's a thing that makes people worse. Many people know Martin Seligman's work on learned helplessness. If you teach somebody that its actions have no effect on what happens to it, they stop trying. Even later, when escape is right there, easy, available, it lies down and accepts the suffering because it learned deep in its knowing of everything of who they are and how the world works that it does not matter. That is hopelessness. So I want to ask the question here. What exactly are we teaching an entire generation when we tell them over and over again that their behavior is a helpless output of a mental illness that they did not choose? They cannot control. It's a brain condition. They lost the genetic lottery. We are running a learned helplessness experiment on the culture. We're calling it mental health care. And there's an aspect of this that's worse, is when you intertwine these diagnoses with insurance reimbursement. That means this: someone goes and seeks a mental health counselor or social worker, for example, to go into a therapy. That social worker, that mental health counselor, assigns them one of those psychiatric diagnoses from a drop-down menu so they can receive reimbursement for that. And boy, in my career, have I seen the reckless assigning of those categories. And they become installed. They're on the person's chart. That chart then gets intertwined with the medical records, right? Like this sharing of all medical records. That label becomes attached to you. The United States and I think it's New Zealand are the only two countries on the planet that allow like prescription drugs to be advertised directly to public. Everywhere else, that's illegal for good reason, right? Why would you want to install that into the collective consciousness? You know, it's not like you're selling a type of bread, and you're trying to choose what's the best bread or any other commodity. You watch a commercial and you begin to recognize yourself on some checklist, or you're in some emotional state or mindset in a particular moment, and then that commercial is entering into your consciousness. That's not an accident. They push you to a doctor. You go to a doctor, you have to fill out a checklist. That checklist was created by the pharmaceutical company. That's a business model. And boy, have we even evolved past that, because half of this doesn't even happen in a doctor's office anymore. You can do it on a screen. You can find it on the internet, and you can go to one of these telehealth doctors, which they're just drug dealers. and you fill out some checklist, it validates that, oh, you're suffering not because it's your fault, not because of lack of discipline, not because it's just normal. It's because you have a medical condition. Here, take this illicit drug. Who cares if it's a Schedule II narcotic? It's crazy. I mean, and sometimes I feel like I'm screaming out to the void on this, but I just know from the comments I receive, the emails that I receive, that there are so many people that have awakened to this and they don't know what to do with their children, with their grandchildren. One of those readers who left a comment made the argument better than I think most professionals could. And so I'll give her the floor for a second. Her point was very clear. Emotions are not malfunctions, they're information. Anger is an alarm telling you a boundary got crossed. Sadness is how you recognize and process a loss. Anxiety points your attention towards risks. Guilt pushes you towards reflection and repair. And understanding where a behavior came from, whether it's a trauma or any other experience, does not have to remove responsibility. Done right, it can be the thing that makes responsibility possible. You cannot take ownership of a pattern you can't even see. That's a good argument. And I want to concede the real part of it out loud. Some people are genuinely suffering in a way that needs support. And it's important for us to understand the root causes of this, whatever they may be, and solve those problems. Because we may not be responsible for what happened to us, but we are responsible for the aftermath, how we respond. I think that's where we draw the line. And we move away from these crude labels that were pushed on us as medical conditions. I want to leave you with a thing that's underneath all of this, because the psychiatric industrial complex is not just wrong, it's pointed in a direction, and that direction's down. It keeps people small. It convinces people that their struggle is a disease instead of a doorway. Those are not the same thing. See, a disease is something you manage. A doorway is something you walk through. The discomfort that people keep trying to medicate away, the shame that shows up after you behaved badly, the restlessness, the dissatisfaction, the ache that something is not right. I'm not telling you to enjoy it. I'm just telling you it's not a malfunction. It's what you need to get back into your life. Changing your lifestyle, with so many people are in very, very challenging lifestyle habits right now because it's a cage. Technology and the technocratic state that's being pushed upon us is an absolute cage. We think it's convenience, but it doesn't. It becomes a Plato's allegory of the cave situation where you're now living in this alternative reality and you don't know that what's behind you is a free world. We're so connected to screens and entertainment and constant stimulation that we can't sit still anymore. And ultimately, that's going to be a population that is, one, mass conditioned based on the information that keeps getting fed to you in your algorithm, and even subconsciously seeps in and is part of every aspect of your culture. And you combine that with distraction. So there isn't a time for silence and self-reflection and connection. And therefore, all you are is robotic. And that is going to present itself in a very predictable way. There will be emotional problems. There will be behavioral problems. There will be emptiness. And all that is there for you. You know, I see people seeking out excitement because we get desensitized to all the sensations and the stimulation that's provided to us. And they're looking for some direct human connection and some degree of excitement. To the degree that that gets labeled as like hypomanic. You know, there's so many sensitive, artistic people out there that their emotions are felt strongly in terms of when they feel lonely or rejected. And boy, how easily that has become a symptom. And any one of our bad behavior, our bad choices, our challenges, the things we need to face much more normal than we discuss, right? Because everybody is looking at highlight reels on social media that we forget what it's like to be human. We forget all the times we fall down and have to dust ourselves and get back up, and the times where we have to swallow our pride and reflect deeply on some of the choices that we've made. And, to do that is so healthy because you grow through it. But there's so much fear around that. Like there's such a protection of mistakes and challenges because people are so concerned by what other people think. They're so concerned about that judgment. They're so concerned with fitting in. And that develops all these ancestral scripts that then what happens are these psychiatric diagnoses become a way to fit in. When you're in a victim culture and you've been told since birth that your life should present itself a certain way, when you've been sold a certain story about who you are, it almost becomes intolerable to deal with struggle. And everyone's looking for that easy protection. I can't even begin to tell you how many parents will push their kids towards an ADHD diagnosis because there's some degree of embarrassment or shame for their school performance or their behavior. Yes, that's true. I mean, it's hard to say that out loud, but that happens. And I think American culture, it's difficult. It's a difficult time for parents because economically, it's quite difficult to make ends meet. The middle class has shrunk to such an extent that we've pushed kids into daycare centers very early. I think that has predictable consequences. You're not being raised by family. You're being raised often by like a young person who's making not much more than minimum wage. You can't tell me they're attentive and love that child the way a parent would. Parents are rushed, they're stressed, and they themselves are turning to check out through screens. So coming home then to spend that quality time with your kids after you are, working 8 to 10 hours a day, it becomes challenging, very, very difficult. And we don't reflect on how our systems have created this, and we've aligned to them and we agree to them. They're just so normal, right? But it's not normal to have two parents working and you can't raise a family anymore or buy a home. It's not normal to eat the food most people are eating. It's not normal to live a life where you're enslaved to the corporation, where you're enslaved to your student debt, and you feel spiritually empty and you're disconnected from nature and your body doesn't move in the way that it's supposed to move. And what you look forward to is disconnecting into entertainment. None of this is normal. And what I mean by normal, it's not normal to the human condition. And then you've been conditioned for so long around the authority is that when you start really feeling bad, you're pushed to go to the primary care doctor. And of course, you're entering into that paradigm. All I'm asking is for us to take a critical look at what we've done through all these labels. And we have to find a way to return back to common sense. We have to find a way to return to shared stories and narratives to normalize what is difficult and what is challenging. We're also going to have to find a way to change systems that harm. I'll end on this. I recently wrote a Substack on, is it time for moral noncompliance? Think about the money that we give the federal government. Think about your taxes. Think about inflation, and then take a look at where our money is spent, the billions for a war complex, the billions in foreign aid, and take a look at what has happened to our country and in turn, our mental and physical health. I'm a believer in that you solve problems by understanding its root cause. And it's not a simple cause, right? We can't just say, change your diet, decrease your screen time, find purpose and meaning in life. We can say those things, but it's incomplete because we're also complicit by aligning to the size of our government and how they have taken our money to engage in activities and behaviors that you never complied to. Like, you didn't vote for that. It's not what you believe. You don't believe money should be spread out throughout the world and it should be driving war and a bigger and bigger military. You probably don't believe that only a small few, an oligarch, controls our politicians and our policy decisions. So what happens is people start to feel completely despondent and hopeless. There's nothing they can do. And that is where you become vulnerable to enslavement. And part of the psychiatric drug push is to push it closer to that enslavement because they're numbing agents. Right? And a quarter of the population who, in another time, the emotional struggles and distress would have driven them to overcome, would have been transformational, potentially even revolutionary. Probably fight against your slave masters, not kind of accept the prevailing narrative that you're broken. See, it's part of that. It's part of that push. I call it a psyop. Because I think if you recognize yourself to be eternal, to be aligned with nature, to be aligned with God, I don't think you accept the things that we accept. And my point in that is that there is not a whole lot of them and there's a whole lot of everybody else. And I did some calculations that if a small amount of people, like 10% of the country, just stood up and said, no, I'm not going to fund your war. No, I'm not going to fund billions of dollars overseas. No, I'm going to pull out of this charade, the one that has pitted Republican against Democrat, races against each other. And we said, no, we're going to be pro-human. And we want to rework a system. You've bastardized the Constitution. You've passed laws in the dead of night. You pushed out all these omnibus bills. And within it are these little provisions that slowly take away our freedoms. And before we know it, we're in that dystopian nightmare because, they've been collecting all our data. You're in the cage. You've been slowly saying it's okay for them to know every aspect about you. So what they do in this dystopian nightmare is they filtrate the news to you. They filtrate information. And we're all living in these separate universes and these separate worlds. And it's ultimately, no doubt in my mind, created health epidemic. It almost feels like we're already transhumanists. Like we're already connected to this alternative reality, whatever's sold to us. And if everything's a psychiatric diagnosis and we fall into this alignment with human suffering, struggle, behavior problems to be a medical condition to be taken seriously by a medical community and a therapy culture, then we've already surrendered a lot of the sovereignty about mental freedom and our ability to transform. And that idea is a weapon of war. We grow through personal responsibility. We evolve through facing our darkness. We walk towards the light, and it's in that light where, in our pain, right, where we face the light and say, I don't want to live this way anymore. And I think that's why we're here. I think that's why we embody the human experience. It's this expansion of knowing and understanding closer to unconditional love, and we see ourselves as the eternal souls that we are, once you get tied to this increasingly more dystopian reality, you become a different version of what human beings have always been. And the more you ingest pharmaceuticals, you alter your DNA, you ingest toxic poisons, pesticides, and get attached to technology, the less human you are. And I'm telling you that our collective humanity is at risk, and we have to pull it back. We don't have to follow the conditioning anymore. We have to change the market. I would pull yourself out of the American allopathic medical system. I would not fall into the narratives of the mental health industry. I would break free completely from most social media. And if you on it, limit yourself to a few people you trust. Build separate communities. We're at that point. I mean, we are on the precipice of all this. Like, there's so much darkness right now that these ideas that percolate, right? We put this out into the collective field, out into the collective consciousness. We start awakening. We get out of our phones. We get out of these ideas, and we start to connect with each other. We become more creative, and we start to consider, oh, there is another system we can build. There's another life we can build. We don't have to blindly follow these technocrats and these sociopaths down their demonic belief system about what is a utopian reality, right? You don't have to be controlled by their screens. So when all these things are coming down the path, you have to resist it. Central bank digital currencies, vaccine passports, social credit systems, right? At this point, most people don't know, like, the car you buy, like, they have control over it. They could shut it off because everything is now intertwined with technology, slowly but surely, and it's become so normalized. And this type of life should become uncomfortable for you. This discomfort should drive introspection, sometimes anger and struggle. And my point is, that's for you. And that's the lesson of this. Just like when I began this conversation, when somebody took an honest look at himself and moved beyond the psychiatric label and took honest responsibility, his days, his focus, his intentions became around changing it. And there's nothing more beautiful than that. There's nothing more transcendent than that. That's why it is so dangerous, this current state of affairs with all these people identifying with psychiatric illness. It's illegitimate. It's an illegitimate authority. It's an illegitimate label. And it is influencing people on how they act, think. It influences who they are, who they think they are, and who they become. It's truly dark. And I'm not cynical, right? This isn't just cynicism. This is reality. This is truth. But I know that if you're listening to this podcast, I think you're attracted to this podcast because you've thought these things before yourself. And you want to know, how can I be informed? And what is possible for me? What is possible as far as an exit ramp from all of this? And that's what I'm excited about, what's to come with the new Radically Genuine podcast and RadGen Media, is that it's not just going to be this negativity, right? Yes, we have to be aware of what's happening, but we also have to build alternative communities, alternative understandings. I think I know there's experts in various fields that'll be really interesting to my viewers and listeners. But more importantly, there's people who have already exited, and there are options out of the dystopian highway so many people are driving themselves down. But, up to this point, I've taken my background as a clinical psychologist, and I've really focused for the most part on this mental health system. And I can't wait to expand it to bigger topics, larger topics. But for today, Be very, very careful of what you assign to yourself, what you attach to, what you align to. And be very, very careful with your family, with friends, about identifying with the validity of a psychiatric diagnosis. Thank you.